I have personal experience with heart disease, and that's what got me interested in this, why I dove down this rabbit hole. I would question whether or not the heart is the sole mover of the blood, and whether or not it's a pressure propulsion pump. There's studies that show that when you look at it that way, it's probably about 30% efficient. The main theory is that the heart is more like a vortexing hydraulic ram. Da Vinci even showed that there was vortexing in the heart.
Okay, so what's the practical take home? How do we use this information in healthcare?
These people have increased ejection fractions, decreased edema, decreased heart size when it's expanded. Some people even reverse the heart failure altogether. We've been told there's 3 phases of water, ice, water, steam, but there's actually a 4th phase.
Ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls, and super intelligent shades of the colour sky blue pink, we really couldn't care less how you identify. Frankly, you're all welcome here, as is my very special guest today, Dr. Stephen Hussey, who is a doctor of chiropractic and has a master's, I believe, in functional medicine as well. Stephen has a lot of ideas around the heart, how it works, what it's supposed to do, circulation and stuff. And I, coming from a background of having been trained as a classic cardiovascular pathophysiologist with all the old ideas, I come from that background. That was my training, despite which I myself have challenged a lot of the dogma in that area. And there are many areas that Stephen and I absolutely agree on completely, such as cholesterol does not cause heart disease, period. Lipoproteins do not cause heart disease, period. Apolipoprotein B does not cause heart disease, period. Neither does Lp(a) or any of that stuff. The cause of heart disease is not a lipid dysfunction. So we've got that together. My training, my background on the mechanical functioning of the heart is, as I say, classic. And I came across the ideas that Stephen has been putting forward a couple of years ago, I think it was. And my usual typical response, in the act of the grumpy professor that I always play online, everyone's an idiot and everyone's wrong, my response to it was somebody asked me a question on a live stream and said, what do you think of these ideas? And I said they sound crazy, basically, because to someone who has a classic training, they do. They sound absolutely crazy. However, today we're here to find out whether or not they really are crazy. So with that in mind, I'm going to shut up and let Stephen outlay his case in terms of a couple of things that he's talking about, those being, what is the heart? How is it supposed to work really? And what have we got wrong, classically, about the way we think about that? And then there's a talk after that about the 4th phase of water, easy water, how that is thought by proponents of the theories that Stephen is talking about, how that affects the functioning of our vascular tree. All of it fascinates the hell out of me, frankly. So Stephen quite rightly responded to me online going, sounds crazy. And he challenged me to say, basically, well, why don't you let me come on and explain myself? And I've grabbed his hand off. Of course, absolutely. So, Stephen, the floor is yours. And then as and when, after you've outlined that, I'll ask you 1 or 2 questions just to play a little bit of devil's advocate. I'm not here to give you a hard time or, play that role today. This is interesting. And I want to see what it is that's is behind all of this. So go for it.
It is really interesting. It's what keeps me looking into it. My background, I have personal experience with heart disease, and that's what got me interested in this, why I dove down this rabbit hole, many different rabbit holes about the heart. The term, the heart is not a pump is thrown around a lot these days, and I don't necessarily agree with it as that finite of a term or of a saying, but I would question whether or not the heart is the sole mover of the blood. That's where I would come from. And whether or not it's a pressure propulsion pump. In that, it's sucking in fluid from somewhere and forcefully pumping it out somewhere else, what we traditionally think of as a pump of fluid. I guess from a historical perspective, there's a lot of scientists, 17, 18, and definitely 1900s that have questioned that as well. There's a really good book, just so people know, called The Heart and Circulation, written by Dr. Branko first. That's probably the most, it's not comprehensive because there's more research that's come out since, but it's probably the most robust collection of, the evidence for this idea that it's not the main mover of the blood. And in that book, he talks about different experiments that people have done over the years, even starting in the 1800s. There was one scientist who set up an experiment trying to move fluid of the same viscosity of blood through what he had. He had dissected parts of the ileum of animal models, and he was trying to move it through there with a pump placed, like a pressure propulsion pump placed where the heart would be in that system, and he could not maintain pressure with a pressure propulsion pump. in the whole system. So he couldn't do it. And then there's other scientists that have shown that blood flows without a contracting heart, and it continues to flow for up to 2 hours. And they controlled for, at first they thought it was, they were artificially ventilating the animal, and they were like, okay, let's eliminate that. And they injected a tracer, and the tracer continued to move for 2 hours. And they're like, okay, something's going on here. The blood's moving in other ways. So yeah, there was all this question about, even William Harvey said that he wasn't sure that the heart was the mover of the blood, or did all the moving of the blood. And he was the person who originally described the heart in circulation. He had questions about it. So there's been all this questioning over the centuries. But yeah, so then this idea that the heart could be a forceful pressure propulsion pump, like there's studies that show that when you look at it that way, it's probably about 30% efficient. As far as like the amount of energy that the heart uses and how efficient it moves fluid, it wouldn't be a very efficient pressure propulsion pump, which, whether you believe we evolved or were designed or whatever, like that's not an efficient way to make something if that's its job, to be 30% efficient. There's, especially in Dr. First's book, he talks about how fluid is moving in an embryo before there's even a heart formed, and the vascular system's not even formed yet, and fluid is moving. And then most recently, Dr. Pollack in his lab, they've shown in chick embryos that you can stop the heart of a chick embryo and you can put infrared light on the blood vessels or on the specimen, and the blood will continue to move, and they increase blood flow 300%. All that stuff is interesting, just different pieces of science you can piece together. The main theory is that the heart is more like a vortexing hydraulic ram. And so I didn't know what hydraulic ram was when I first read that. I had to go look it up. But it's a type of pump, so to speak, but it's flow activated. It doesn't really work unless there's something flowing into it. And there's a few differences, obviously, between a human heart or an animal heart and a hydraulic ram. But the main ones is that we have contracting ventricles that are, signals being sent from the brain to contract the ventricles, whereas a hydraulic ram has it doesn't really contract. It just builds up pressure and pushes back down. And so, like, if people want to understand how hydraulic ram works, they can go, there's YouTube videos that are very short. They can look at that. And like in my book, I point out the analogous structures between hydraulic ram and the heart, and how it's actually two hydraulic rams put together, the left side and the right side. But people ask, well, then how is the blood moving if the heart is not forcefully pumping it? It turns out that there are many other mechanisms of blood flow. There's the ones we classically learn as far as like muscle contraction or one-way valves in the veins and things like that. But the main one is something that I think Dr. Pollack has made most famous, which is structured water on the lining of the arteries and how it creates blood flow. And they've shown that, like in the chick embryo case that I described. And that's newer research that just came out a few years ago. And so that's flow activation. We're activating fluid flow. And then that's how hydraulic ram actually works. So we've got this rhythmic contraction with blood flowing into it. And Dr. First talks about studies where they're actually not measuring cardiac output, they're measuring cardiac throughput, where they've artificially increased the heart rate and the cardiac output doesn't change. So the same amount of blood is moving through the heart despite an increased heart rate, because the job of a contracting heart is to actually kind of swish up or vortex or spiral blood as it moves through the chambers of the heart, and not necessarily forcefully pump it. Another piece of evidence is that if you look at the aorta, you would expect, like if you had a curl-up hose and you forcefully turned water on and the force came through, the hose would unravel. So you'd think if there was this large amount of force as the heart was pumping, so to speak, and pushing that blood out of the left ventricle, that we'd see a kind of expansion of the aorta, and we don't. We see a curling up of it like this, which suggests that it's almost sucking. Not that there's any kind of sucking force coming from that, but it's magnetic properties of blood that are like when the valve opens, it sucks the blood out. It magnetically attracts it out, which also has to do with easy water, which we can get into if you want. There's a lot of different pieces of evidence that suggest that it's not this pressure propulsion pump, and it's not responsible for or solely responsible for the movement of blood. I would say it does do a little bit of pumping, but it's not the main way that blood moves, especially when it gets to the capillaries, down into the small blood vessels. There's no way. There's scientists that have said that we would need the heart the size of a whale to create the blood flow in our circulation through 60 miles of blood vessels, So, yeah.
Excellent. All right. So far what we've got is this. People running around saying the heart is not a pump sounds crazy. And the reason it sounds crazy is because it is crazy. The heart is a pump. Absolutely. What Stephen Hussey is saying is the kind of pump that it is a different kind of pump to the kind that we are classically trained that it is. We are classically trained to believe that it is a pressure propulsion pump. And it seems that there is very good inference from a lot of different convergent lines of evidence, one of my big bugbears that I hate other people using, but that's what this is, that would suggest to us that what we are dealing with here is some kind of hydraulic ram which relies on electromagnetic fields. great. What's the upshot of it? What's the practical take home? How do we use this information in healthcare or in our daily lives if we're not involved in healthcare personally? I guess to boil all of that down, Stephen, what I'm saying is, okay, so?
Well, how are you supposed to understand how something dysfunctions if you don't understand how it functions?
Perfect. Carry on.
If we don't understand that it's not a pressure propulsion pump and that it's a hydraulic ram, then how are we supposed to understand heart failure? I mean, there's many different components of heart failure. Mitochondrial dysfunction is one of them. And I have theories about why the mitochondria play a role in that. But the other aspect is that maybe the heart is being forced to be too much of a pressure propulsion pump than it's supposed to be. Whenever we have mechanisms that break down in the periphery that aren't moving blood like it's supposed to be. And so then the heart is like the blood is getting kind of almost pulled up in the ventricles when it's supposed to be kind of somewhat moving through on its own. And now the heart is having to kind of forcefully pump, and that's causing this distension of the ventricles, which is what happens in heart failure eventually, dilated cardiomyopathy. It gets this expansion, looks more like a basketball than an American football. And so, and it all at that point, it also loses its vortexing ability, which way back, Da Vinci even showed that there was vortexing in the heart and vortexing flow patterns. And when you distend the heart, it loses that. So that's very relevant. But then the thing that really drives it home for me is work with structured water has shown that infrared light is the main thing that helps charge up the body and build structured water. And you look at the research on infrared sauna and heart failure, it's absolutely phenomenal. These people see huge improvements in their heart failure, which makes sense to me because the sun is 40 to 50% infrared light anytime the sun is out. So that's where this comes from as far as life on the planet. But we can use it in a concentrated amount in a sauna. And these people have increased injection fractions, decreased edema, decreased heart size when it's expanded. Some people even reverse the heart failure altogether. Obviously, there's something there. And clinically, that's very relevant. And that research being out there, it's mainly out of Japan. It just baffles me why medicine there's no like infrared sauna in every cardiac rehab center everywhere. It would be extremely useful for people.
So hang on. Just a minute here, Stephen. Are you suggesting for a second that living as we naturally do, getting decent amount of sunlight on our skin is better than taking a toxic drug which destroys the function of our mitochondria in terms of dealing with congestive heart failure?
Absolutely.
That's nuts. I'm kidding. Just a bit. Fascinating. Okay, so I mean, it's a great segue, I think, into the proposed mechanisms of this, let's call it self-propulsion of the blood, shall we say, in the peripheral vasculature, and what it is that's driving this according to this new theory around easy water and infrared and etc.
Yeah. Well, for people who may not be familiar with fourth phase of water, just kind of a primer of how I understand it. We've been told there's three phases of water: ice, water, steam, but there's actually a fourth phase, so to speak, that it can get into, and it's more like a gel. So like consistency of raw egg white, and most of the water in our bodies, like in cells and things, is in this state, which is why I feel like a gel, and then I bounce back, but it does exist in the vascular system too. And there's way more than just Dr. Pollack who's found this, or at least found something. They didn't know what to call it, but there's tons of studies that call it a cell-free layer on the lining of the blood vessels. So if you just type in cell-free layer in any search engine, you'll see all these studies that come up, and they've found that there's this layer next to the lining of the blood vessel where the red blood cells can't get to. And even the glycocalyx has been described as this anticoagulant gel layer. This layer of structured water exists as a gel sits on the lining of the artery, or sits next to any biological surface. So that's kind of the recipe you need. You need water, you need energy to that water, and you need a water-loving surface, a hydrophilic surface. And when this happens, the water seems to kind of structure itself, rearrange itself into this gel state. And how it does that is that, water is an oxygen and two hydrogens, and one of the hydrogens gets cleaved off, and the other oxygen and hydrogens team up with other oxygens and hydrogens. They make this lattice-like structure, like this honeycomb-like structure that kind of binds up, and it forms these layers, and it kind of goes on top of things. And it appears, because of the way that it forms, it excludes things. So people have called it exclusion zone water or easy water. So exclusion means that it's like nothing can really penetrate it, or only small hydrated ions of minerals can penetrate it, which means that red blood cells are way too big. Lipoproteins, like we said we agree on, they're way too big. So this is one thing that can potentially make them irrelevant. If we have structured water, then this whole theory that lipoproteins go and they embed themselves in the line of the artery, which seems ridiculous to me anyways, is even more ridiculous when we have structured water there. Dr. Pollack has found in chick embryos that this forms on the lining of the artery, and they have very nice little diagrams diagrams where they show there's this easy water next to it. But they also showed that this water, because of the way that it forms an energy gradient. So it's a storage form of energy. Because of the structured water's nature and how it's an oxygen that's not balanced by two hydrogens, then oxygen is very electronegative. So it creates a very electronegative charge of structured water. Also, because these oxygens and hydrogens are teamed up and they have these connections, now the electrons can travel through it. So it makes it very electronegatively charged. And the hydrogens that were cleaved off, they go into the space next to it, and that creates a very positively charged area, and a positive and a negative charge next to each other is a battery. That's why we have batteries that have positive and negative charge. And in Pollack's lab, they did an experiment where they put an electrode into the negative side, into the positive side, and they powered a light bulb. So clearly there's energy there. And it seems in a tube that this energy does the work of moving fluid. So they put a tube made of a hydrophilic substance or material into a vat of water. They shine infrared light on it. The structured water starts to form on the interior of the tube, and the water starts moving through the tube with no pump acting on it. And so then they went and they proved this in the chick embryo too. So in a living, I guess it was dead when they euthanized it and stopped the heart from beating, but then they kept the blood moving. Well, the blood kept moving after the heart stopped. And then when they shined infrared light on it, I think they said up to 300% increase in blood flow. This is very important for heart failure, like we talked about. Blood needs to move in other ways, so the heart doesn't have to be forced to be more of a pump than it's supposed to be. But it's also relevant for me for protecting the lining of the artery from atherosclerosis, just another layer that can protect the artery from things. Structured water also significantly decreases friction. So when things are moving through the blood, they slide through a lot easier. And then the other thing for me is that I have a lot of evidence, or found a lot of evidence, that atherosclerosis, or a large component of atherosclerosis, is because of poor blood flow dynamics, changes in blood flow, interrupted blood flow. And so if we consider the fact that blood moves via this mechanism, then that's something that could be very helpful. And then you look at, studies with infrared sauna again, or sunlight, and you see the benefits that they have to the endothelia. And is it because they're building the structured water and protecting it so the endothelia can do its thing without being damaged? Maybe you can put those things together and potentially determine that.
Okay. All right. So all of that's brilliant. And, I read through some of that stuff, as I say, I think first time about 2 years ago when I started looking into this. So it's not new to me. There are a couple of things that I do like to throw out, though, just to see what folks that know something about this say. A phospholipid bilayer, which makes up the membrane of an endothelial cell. Can you outline the structure of that phospholipid bilayer in terms of how it works to separate two fluid compartments?
You mean is it a hydrophilic surface, or is it hydrophobic? Is that what you're getting at?
That is exactly what I'm getting at, yes. So if we're saying that...
We have glycocalyx.
Thank you. Right. Great. You've got it. Right. So tell us all about that.
Biological tissue looks like a shag carpet that's sitting there like this, kind of these things that, are said to protect the lining of the artery, but it's described by scientists as a gel-like layer, and they assume it's the glycocalyx. I would say that's providing a lot of surface area for structured water to form on in those there, which is what it needs. The surface area is what it needs.
So if we expose a certain patch, shall we say, an area of the endothelial lining of the vascular tree to some physically injurious, damaging input of some kind that disturbs, breaks down the integrity of that glycocalyx, which sits over the hydrophobic zone, forming this hydrophilic zone. If we destroy that glycocalyx, does that make that patch that we've damaged suddenly susceptible to some kind of influence that may well cause the atherosclerotic lesioning to occur?
We call it physical damage, or even just like as you described, it's hydrophobic. So now this blood that's half water, the water doesn't really like that area. So everything else that's in the blood could stick to it. Right. We're also remove that the structured water creates this frictionless barrier. So removing that, now things are just getting stuck. And so like stagnant stuff, that's what Rudolf Virchow back in 1856 told us causes clotting. And if you analyze atherosclerosis, it's primarily clotting tissue. That makes a lot of sense to me. But the other thing is that when we talk about these things that are potentially injuring the lining of the artery, there's many different things that it could be that have been shown to do that. But they're all things that these terms are thrown around, like inflammation or oxidative stress or all those different things. To me, all it means is this stealing of electrons. That's what it means. And so since structured water is this large store of electrons, you get this accumulation of stuff. It could be endotoxins from poor dental health or gut health. It could be so many different things stealing that charge, and then they take away that structured water, they take away the glycocalyx, and then boom, now those things are killing the lining of the artery, causing this damage to the endothelia. And we've lost this adequate blood flow. So we're creating stagnant. So we're creating injury and stagnant blood. That's a bad situation.
Excellent. And how does that fit in with the theory that I personally subscribe to as the most important aspect of atherosclerosis development, being that these lesions occur predictably in exact zones within the endothelial lining areas that we can map beforehand before it ever starts developing? We can say, if this person develops atherosclerosis in the future, this is where it will be. It won't be over here. It will be here and here and there and there and there and there. And these are all regions that are subject to turbulent flow due to the hemodynamics of blood flow, i.e. bifurcations and curvatures. Ergo, you get turbulence happening there, you get an increased transit time and increased pressure against that particular area of the endothelial lining. You get mechanical damage of the glycocalyx. How does that fit?
Yeah, exactly. If you have this area of bifurcation or you have this turn in the artery or something like that, that's an opportunity for vortices to form in blood flow. And if there's nothing there, like on the lining of the artery to, like, when that vortice forms, keep it moving still, like if that structured water is not there, that's going to be the spot where you see the plaque. Also, those are places under higher pressure. So if there is things that are damaging to the lining of the artery, they're being pushed up against those places more so than other areas. So that's just going to be breaking down structured water, damaging glycocalyx and endothelium more. But there's fascinating work by this guy named Meyer Texan, I'm not sure how you say his name, which was done the same time that Keyes was making up the cholesterol theory back in the 50s and 60s. And he created atherosclerosis in dogs just by changing blood flow dynamics. And so it's interesting to see that. That was the only factor that he changed.
All right. So what we're saying there is that hypothesis remains workable in the model that you're working under, which is, great and gratifying for me, I guess. It seems that the thing that drives this vortices, I suppose you call them, this turbulent flow, more than anything else, is chronic hypertension. Talk to us a bit about how this easy water, the electromagnetic thing, and perhaps even something as simple as grounding yourself electrically, how that affects the likelihood for hypertension, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it. If you've got a tube and that tube is trying to get fluid moving through it, and you've got the structured water on the outside that's, helping blood move that way, and then all of a sudden you don't have it, right? Then the body's going to try and create a way to get blood moving faster again. And so it constricts, right? Which is the same thing. Like you put your thumb over the end of a water hose and the water comes out more quickly, it looks like. Same kind of thing. That's why we see things like when you look at the things that help us build structured water, basically I would say you're just getting energy to the body. You're getting electrons to the body is what I'd say, which could be sunlight, could be grounding, putting your feet directly on the earth, conducting low voltage electricity into you, or even that's, you could say it's the point of metabolism to harvest electrons from food. So that's what we're trying to do. That's what life is. We're just trying to gain energy from our environment. And so when you don't have enough of that, your body's trying to keep blood moving. And one of the ways they can do that is constrict the area through which blood has to move to increase it, keep it moving faster. But then I just remembered too, what I was going to say is that have you read Sabotin's work?
I haven't.
He has this theory, and this kind of goes hand in hand with what Meyer Texan is saying, because Meyer Texan is saying that there's kind of like this Goldilocks amount of blood flow that we should have. And if it's too fast and the blood's moving too fast through there's not enough pressure on the artery walls. But also if it's moving too slow, there's not enough pressure on the artery walls. And when there's not enough pressure, not only is there constriction to try and increase the flow, there's also proliferation of the endothelia to try and make the blood vessel narrower. And so that fits in hand with what Sabotin says. I think his name's Vladimir Sabotin, where he says that what is happening is when there's either damage and proliferation of endothelia, or what Meyer Texan says, there's not this Goldilocks amount of blood flow, endothelia starts growing in, and the blood vessels, the vasa vasorum that feed the arteries and endothelium, they have to start growing in. And when they start growing in, like when you build new blood vessels, you're going to have fenestrations at first. So things are going to start leaking out of them. And that's where we get this debris and we get this kind of stagnant flow or this accumulation of blood in the stagnant area. And that's going to create clotting tissue. And that's why we see it in the wall, because it's coming from the vasa vasorum. It's not coming from here. So that was a thing that I put together, like maybe it's the blood flow issue. And so to me, I don't know, it would make sense philosophically to think that structured water creating blood flow, especially in periphery, would give us that Goldilocks amount of adequate blood flow, because I don't know that you could you can like turn that up or turn that down. It's just kind of, it's there. It's going to be creating the flow.
All right. So you've got the vagal tone dynamic range, which can affect blood pressure, obviously. You've got proliferation of the endothelial cells that you're just talking about now, which will again cause a reduction in the diameter of the lumen, thus achieving the same thing as vasoconstriction, but on a more permanent way. The other factor that I've been looking at is the fact that blood, being a non-Newtonian fluid, does not have a set viscosity.
Yes.
So we're talking about the zeta potential thing. So do you want to outline that for us?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost, you need enough water in the system. We got a hydraulic system here. And if you don't have enough water in that system, you're creating more like sludge. Things are not going to be moving as adequately. But yes, then the other aspect of it is like we want to keep things in the blood, the elements of blood, evenly spaced and electrically charged, so that they can respond to this movement. So you think about it, biological surfaces seem to attract structured water. And this is one case where you may say, well, this red blood cell with the bilayer, like how is it forming structured water? I don't know. All we know is that they have an electronegative charge. I don't think that anybody's found exactly, yes, that electronegative charge is because of structured water, but that's one thing that I know is electronegatively charged in the bloodstream. So it could be that, but the zeta potential have this electrical charge, and like charges repel each other. So if they get too close together, they don't clump or they don't stick together. They stay evenly spaced, but they are attracted to the positively charged blood because of the hydrogen ions that have been cleaved off and are now in the lumen of the artery. So as the structured water on the lining of the artery moves this hydrogen positive fluid, then the electronegatively charged elements of blood are moving with it. Right. They're being attracted to it and sticking with it as they go, but they're also evenly spaced. So you can think of it like train cars hooked together, sort of, moving evenly like this. They're never going to get too close unless they're a train wreck or something, but they're just going to evenly move through there. So that keeps this blood less viscous, so to say. So I always say there's a biophysical way to thin the blood rather than a biochemical one, which is, they're very different things. So yeah, this zeta potential, they've shown that grounding, being connected to the earth, definitely increases your zeta potential, or at least the spacing of red blood cells. We're not getting a rouleau formation or agglutination of red blood cells. We're seeing them evenly spaced in the solution. And then as well as grounding has also been shown to increase blood flow. So we can speculate that that's because there's structured water being formed or there's more charge to the system, and that's creating better, adequate blood flow.
Great synergy there. Great synergy there. I can't even speak. I've read a thing that was they were looking at the effective viscosity of blood in microvasculature-sized tubules, where they connected that blood to earth and found an immediate decrease in the viscosity of that blood to 1/3 based on...
Wow.
1/3. So when you think about what that would do in terms of the blood pressure, sure, vascular tone adjusts, absolutely. But that's one of the reasons why electrical grounding is absolutely on my list of the health hacks that a person should undertake on a daily basis.
The rest of all life on Earth is ground except for humans.
Yeah, exactly that. All right, well, that's good. So there are some definite synergies there. And while all of that sounds crazy to the uninitiated, even the educated uninitiated, I don't think you've said anything today that's remotely crazy. And I think it's all stuff that is well worth investigating a lot more deeply. And once again, I thank you for challenging me to have this discussion instead of just giving the off-the-cuff response thing as per the Act. So, yeah, a lot of people perhaps wouldn't have done that. So thanks for that. That said, let's move on a bit to capillaries, the microvasculature, that network of endothelia specifically. In your understanding, do those have a microcalyx? Do they form easy water? We know it happens in the arteries. That's been observed. Is it happening in the capillaries, in the very smallest of our vessels?
Yes. So one of the studies that I talked about with the cell-free layer, they say in the microvasculature, that's where they found it, that cell-free layer. There's other ones that say in other arteries. But so yes, they're calling it a cell-free layer, and Pollock and his team speculate that cell-free layer is exclusions on water based on what they found. But yeah, so there's some evidence.
So the evidence is that it is that. Okay, great. And has it not been said that easy water exclusion zone excludes many of the formed elements in the blood, including the lipoprotein carriers?
Yes. So,
All right.
I mean, technically it's the Hofmeister series of hydrated ions. So the cutoff is sodium potassium, which anybody trained in cellular physiology should have like, what? That should be interesting. But that's the cutoff. And so anything larger, sodium or larger, is not going to penetrate structured water technically.
And we know that LDL is
lipoproteins.
massively larger than a sodium ion. Massively. Okay. So
Definitely.
that being said, how is it that we can absorb cholesterol from the LDL transporters into our cells if they're excluded from contacting our cells?
Well, capillaries are not what is excluded. A capillary is still a blood vessel. When we're talking about the swamp that is between where capillaries and capillary veins, like that's where the absorption happens, where there's just kind of this fluid. It's like like a swamp, and then things start moving through the other way. So that's where it happens. That's where the absorption happens. That's where you're contacting cells directly in that.
So are you saying then that the absorption of the adhesion, if you like, of LDL particles that are delivering cholesterol and other lipids to the cells are not proposed to be doing that by contacting those cells directly and offloading their goods, I suppose, into those cells? Because if the LDL is carried by the blood and solely by the blood, and it's moving through the vascular tree, including the capillaries. And the capillaries, even at the smallest end, have this easy water exclusion, which does not allow this to occur. Please explain, is what I'm saying.
I'm saying that once they leave the capillaries, that's when the nutrient exchange happens. There's no transport of a molecule. If there's exclusion of water, healthy artery, no transport of a molecule through any sort of artery, whether it's capillary or larger.
So are you suggesting it's all venous?
No, I'm saying there's an area between the two. That's the swamp area. That's where they leave and they access the cells. That's going deep into the tissues.
Right. So
that's where we get to the tissue.
Okay. So explain the swamp area. Where does it exist? How does it exist? In what form does it exist? And what borders this zone of fluid, I guess?
I mean, this is tissues. We're going into tissues.
Okay.
So that's how they would access cellular tissues. But you could describe it as a swamp because there's no literal like tubes that's holding water now. We're talking about extracellular fluid.
All right. So how does the LDL get out of the vasculature into this extracellular space? Extravascular space, I should say.
I don't know. Do you have an answer? Only God knows.
That's why I asked the question. I'm wondering whether like endocytosis is the answer. Exocytosis, endocytosis. The very thing that's often thrown at us is by those that are ill-educated in the zone, that tells us that our theories are not good.
That's where they're saying that happens inside the lumen of an artery,
right?
Which I would say never happens. This exchange of nutrients, whether it's for oxygen from a red blood cell or cholesterol from a lipoprotein or whatever it may be, that's happening at the level of the tissues when capillaries go in and they just kind of release and the tissues are absorbing what they want and then it moves back out. But like in an artery, the way the endothelial cells get that is vasovasorum. They have their own arteries that supply it. They're not coming from the lumen of the artery. It's coming from the other way. And that's what Sabotin says, that's why when the vasovasorum has to grow, because when arteries grow, like they're not complete yet, they have fenestrations, and that's when things are leaking out. And that's when we get too much leaking out there because they're trying to grow new arteries rather than this set system that's supposed to be there. And that's when we get this kind of backup of stuff. But that's all a response to endothelia growing for some reason, whether that's from damage or like Mayor Texan showed that it was from lack of pressure. So the artery is trying to grow more endothelium to keep the pressure maintained. There's something that's making endothelia grow in a normal way, but that's causing issues in deeper levels of the arterial system or the arterial layers.
Okay. So I guess what you're suggesting there is that there has to be some way, somehow, some kind of discontinuity between the very finest of the capillaries and the very smallest of the veins. In which case, there is fluid moves through the vascular tree on the high pressure side, it gets to the very smallest of the capillaries, and then somehow it ends up in the veins. If they're not continuous, which is what you're suggesting, as in capillary, vein. If there's no continuous junction here that the fluid just flows through in a vessel, what on earth is going on? Okay, so you're talking about these fenestrations, which is a French word for windows, by the way, gaps. Right. Gaps between the cells. That's only happening when there's new blood vessel growth, when there's fenestrations. Right. Yeah. If they're complete blood vessels, then they shouldn't happen. Okay. If there's chronic systemic inflammation, is there not leakiness as well? You'd probably be right there. Yeah, so there are different situations under which the cell integrity, the joining of the cells is loosened and there are gaps. How does that fit with the theory that easy water is a layer that is continuous, that excludes things like LDL from crossing that barrier from the inside of the vasculature to the extravascular space? That's the question.
You mean in the layers of the artery? I mean, because in a tissue, we want the cholesterol to leave. We want the LDL to go out and deliver things.
But how does something as large as an LDL get outside of the vasculature and get into the space outside of the vascular lumen?
I would say that it doesn't. You analyze what plaque is, and it's clotting tissue. There's very little cholesterol present.
That's correct. There is not. It's about 1/10 of 1% in most lesions.
Yeah, and I would say that's the only reason that's there is because it was probably around when the clotting response happened, and it just got caught up in it.
Yeah, there are a bunch of factors that are attracted to a damaged tissue, adhesion molecules that cause LDL to adhere there. That still doesn't answer the question of how did it get there, the LDL. How did it leave the blood proper in the space in the lumen moving through the vascular tree? How did it get outside of that? Because easy water, if it exists in capillaries, excludes anything bigger than sodium. That's the question I'm still trying to get to.
I've told you the answer already. It's when new blood vessels are forming from the vasovasorum, trying to reach the new levels of endothelia that are being grown in the lumen. When those new blood vessels are forming, they're not complete blood vessels. They're leaky.
So they're open-ended things. Is that what you're saying?
The fenestrations are there. They will eventually become, if we have good angiogenesis and that kind of stuff, they'll eventually become whole ones. But while they're growing, and the more that vascular, like the endothelial space, the more that keeps growing, the more fenestration, the more new blood vessels trying to keep getting to it. Yeah, that's Sabotin's theory. And he has some good images that outline that. So
sorry, I missed your meaning as to how.
No, not at all. I was thinking you were saying how do nutrients get into tissues?
No,
you were saying yeah. So I was trying to think about that. No, that's fine. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. Okay, so we're saying for those that are, operating on a level of perhaps not having had the background that Stephen and I have had, that there's always new blood vessels forming on a daily basis. One of the roles of some of these new blood vessels is actually to subserve the tissues of the existing blood vessels from the other side. Mm-hmm. And these developing tubes have an open end, a window. We're not talking about gap junctions, leaky stuff like the inflammation stuff. We're talking about a hole in the end so that a small amount of fluid is able to be pushed out of that tube into the space outside or on the other side of the endothelial cells. Is that what we're saying, Stephen? Yeah,
I would say that. And it's really interesting, too, as you were describing that, I'm reminded of these studies I found talking about, again, embryonic vasculature and heart formation even, and how embryonic fluid is moving before the formation of those. And it's actually the movement of them. And have you ever poured out water on concrete and you see that there's a parabola? It's there's a point that's going first, right? And that point that's going first is going before the ends over here. And so it's really interesting. There's these studies that I found mostly out of Germany, and they have the images of what they're showing. And there's this parabola of fluid moving before, and then the walls are forming back here. The endothelial walls are forming back here, but they're behind where the fluid is moving. So it's yes, before that can form, there's things going out of it, which are blood contents,
All right. Okay. All of that said, I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I've learned something today, and I'm sure that the viewers have learned something of value as well, in terms of having, I guess, a mindset to be prepared to challenge the accepted dogma and to propose other models, and also to be prepared to challenge authority. So when I'm doing my usual, I am the science, trust me, I'm safe and effective, and don't question me thing on the interwebs, as I say, I'm very, very pleased that Stephen had the wherewithal to say to me, hang on a minute here. Sure, maybe it sounds crazy, but let me explain it to you. And I'm very, very glad that Stephen did give up his valuable time today to come and explain that to us. And I don't think anything that he's saying is inconsistent with what I think I already understand about heart disease. So I do thank you very much for that, Stephen. Tell us where people can find you, social media, your books, all of that stuff, so that they can do a deep dive into this for themselves.
Well, first I'll say thank you for having me on and being open and just having conversation, because these conversations are how we learn. Your perspective opens up mine. So that's beautiful. But where can people find me? My website is resourceyourhealth.com. Most of what I have available for content and learning and things like that are on there. And then I'm also on social media, just Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey with a PH. People can reach out there if they want to as well.
Awesome. All right. Right. Well, once again, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it very much. And I really do hope that the viewers got something out of it. If you did, let us know about it in the comments, both while it's a live premiere presentation and also in the pre-recorded version of the video on the YouTubes when it comes out after the premiere. Don't forget to share this out to all your social media feeds as a really good video and as a showcase of how the scientific discussions should probably be. You know, this is more along the lines of where I want to be going in future, because I am getting pretty tired of the everyone's wrong on interwebs act. That said, if you want to push a vegan agenda, I'm still going to do the same act with you, whoever you might be. All right? Because you're wrong. There's no two ways about that. And if you want to push the cholesterol causes heart disease barrow, you're wrong. And I'm going to continue in the same regard. That said, Stephen is our esteemed guest, so he gets to have the last words.
I would encourage people to explore these things. What I said today is just based off what I've, read, like the science and literature and things that I've read and put together in my own way. But like the book I showed earlier, Heart and Circulation, absolutely fascinating. I could probably read it 3 more times and get new information from it. So I would encourage people go into that stuff if you're really interested in this, because what you gain out of it may be different than mine. And that's how we all learn. So yeah, really encourage that.
Beautiful. The world's a great place, or at least it could be. See you next time when someone will probably be wrong on the interwebs. Ciao for now.